Reparations were paid to slave owners for letting the slaves go. When they abolished slave trade and said the slaves could go, they compensated the person who has enslaved somebody for loss of property. As recently as 2015, compensation was paid to people for losing their slaves. And you come and tell me that we recognize this as a grievous crime, and you say, oh, but Africans were involved. In the record of the Holocaust, there were Jews who were prison guards. There were Jews who pointed out where other Jews were hiding.
President Mahama is conflating issues. He said compensation was paid to slave owners as recently as 2015. That is grossly misleading. In 1833, the British government paid £20 million, a massive sum then, to slave owners as compensation for abolishing slavery. That money was paid in the 1830s, not 2015. What ended in 2015 was the final repayment of the loan Britain took to fund that compensation. No living slave owner received money in 2015. All original recipients had been deceased for over a century. Compare this to Germany's reparation for the Holocaust. Germany began paying in the 1950s to living survivors and to the State of Israel for resettlement costs, not to descendants generations later. Payments were made while many perpetrators and victims were still alive. That is fundamentally different from the transatlantic slave trade, where no victims are alive today. Now, on African participation, he compared it to a few Jews who were prison guards or pointed out others. This comparison is totally wrong. The transatlantic slave trade was not the work of a few bad Africans. Powerful African kingdoms, Dahomey, Ashanti, Oyo Empire, and the Aro Confederacy ran large-scale systematic slave raiding operations for centuries. They captured and sold millions of fellow Africans to Europeans in exchange for guns, clothes, alcohol, and other goods. This was not minor collaboration. It was a major commercial enterprise by African states. These kingdoms already practiced slavery before Europeans arrived. Europeans simply offered goods they valued more than keeping the captives. It was a willing, profitable partnership between African suppliers and European buyers. Finally, if we accept the principle of reparations, a practical question remains: who exactly should receive the money in 2026? The last victims of transatlantic slave trade were deceased over 80 years ago. Should corrupt African governments receive billions on behalf of people who passed on generations before they were born? Will the money actually reach ordinary citizens, or will it disappear like so many other funds? Victim mentality should have no place in Africa. But if you insist on being victims, the Ashanti Kingdom captured, enslaved, and traded members of the Gonja ethnic group. President Mahama should start by asking the Ashanti people in Ghana to pay his own Gonja group compensation. You cannot selectively remember history. If we are to discuss historical wrongs, honestly, we must acknowledge all participants, African kingdoms included, and focus on practical solutions for today's problems rather than chasing reparations from events no living person was directly involved in. Think sharper.